agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Joining me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I am hanging in there. How about you?
I am also hanging in there, doing our best with everything going on.
Absolutely. You know, before we start today, I just want to quickly thank Phil, Wayfarer, and everyone else who read over and commented on the first 3 chapters of my book in progress, The Reluctant Detectives, kind of a fun little diversion, I think, with all the serious stuff going on. And just to let people know, if you'd like to follow along as sort of the plot thickens, at least I hope the plot will thicken, and even comment on the book and make suggestions. I have put everything in a Google Doc that's set up for reader suggestions and comments. It's been great kind of doing this along with some listeners. I've really appreciated it, and you'll find a link in today's show notes. So thanks a lot, guys. I want to let everyone know about something new that we're going to be doing for supporters. You know, with coronavirus moving all of my classes at NKU online, I'm having to create a bunch of audio lectures for students, and I thought I'd share this with supporters. Now, right now, my discussion of Congress is up there, and in that I talk about structure, leadership, campaign finance, gerrymandering, demographics, the legislative process, filibusters, polarization, all kinds of stuff. Future posts are going to get into the presidency and the executive branch, the Supreme Court, public policy, the 2020 elections, and some proposals to change the structure of American political institutions. And of course, in addition to that, if you're a supporter, you get that full-length bonus episode every week, in addition to a bunch of other things at various levels. To check it out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. We will never keep content from anyone due to financial constraints. So if you would like all of our bonus content, but you can't afford to be a supporter right now, we totally get that. Just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get you set up. And one more quick thing. In response to that Share on Twitter contest I announced last week, one listener commented, can't you do something where everyone who takes the time to share the podcast gets something, as opposed to me having a 1 in 100 chance of getting a benefit? And, you know, that seemed like a pretty good point, actually. And so I decided to change things up a little bit. Now, throughout the month of, it is April. Yeah, it's April. That's right. Gosh. Everyone who shares an episode of the show on Twitter and includes a short message about why people should listen, why they like the show, as well as making sure to include our Twitter name at Politics Guys so we can see who's doing what, will get access to the next midweek supporters exclusive full-length show. So when I see your tweet, I'll just DM you with information on how to access the upcoming show. So this is quick and simple, and everyone benefits. It's kind of a win-win, which is always a beautiful thing. So I have a pretty good idea where we're going to start today, Kristen, and why don't you go ahead and get us kicked off?
Might as well just jump right in. So there's a lot to talk about regarding everything dealing with the COVID-19 situation, so many different angles and aspects. Lots going on this week. We are experiencing some phenomenal cultural shifts. So sort of looking at things on a macro level. As those who are not essential workers are practicing social distancing, I'm sure you are, I am. I'm sure most of our listeners are, unless they are essential workers. So lots of that going on. And there are a lot of other topics to discuss, from President Trump's extension of federal guidelines that are, he's recommending that people stay at home in place, away from other people for another 30 days. Of course, that's different from what was being recommended a week or two ago. And we can also tie all of this into sort of the ever-evolving statistics. It's really hard to keep track of everything. Most predictions have hard-hit areas peaking in numbers of those affected throughout mid to late April, some of them into early May. So we'll discuss that. And also we have some big shifts in the economy that really beg discussion. Jobless claims are rising. The Small Business Administration announced a paycheck protection program, which many have begun applying for. And that was the applications for those begun yesterday. So we'll get into that. And of course, resources are being haggled over between cities, states, and the federal government as everyone scrambles to stockpile PPE, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, much more. And of course, we're going to talk about masks, because for a long time we heard that masks were something that wouldn't prevent infection. And now all of a sudden there seems to be this rush for masks. So, we have a lot to discuss, Mike. But of course, we're going to start at sort of the macro level, and we're going to discuss the stay-at-home order first and some of the evolving statistics. Any thoughts on that to kickstart things?
Yeah, sure. I'm gratified to see that almost all states now have stay-at-home orders. I think there are, at this point, and this is Saturday, we're recording this, 5 that have no stay-at-home orders only, and then there are another 4 that have them in parts of the state. And so I think that's a very positive thing. And I also, on another positive note, because almost all of what we're talking about by necessity is pretty awful and negative stuff, I wanted to, without minimizing in any way the awfulness of this, I thought maybe some historical comparisons might kind of help people feel a little, I don't know, necessarily a little bit better. But so I did some comparisons with the 1918 and 1957 pandemics on a per capita death basis to kind of give a sense of perspective. And so even if we include in not just the coronavirus death numbers, and that the high end of that seems to be a little over 200,000 now is what we're hearing. And I should point out that even a month ago, people were talking about 1 million or more. And so in that sense, I think an underreported story is how a lot of those estimates all of a sudden have come down. It seems like a lot of the media has forgotten about that. And I really think that's, something we should point out. But even assuming, let's say, a high-end estimate of 250,000 deaths, which is horrific, and adding in the deaths that we're going to get from just the standard flu season, which, it looks like that might be another 50,000 or so, because we also have seasonal flu. Mm-hmm. 300,000 deaths combined, say, out of a population of, for right now, we're around 331 million. Well, if we take a look at the 1957 flu pandemic, there were 116,000 who died in the U.S. out of a population of 172 million. And that's a per capita equivalent today of that would be around 223,000. So that's, that was a little less severe if we add in the flu deaths and go again to the high end number, what we're projecting. And that still is, that's being pessimistic. But if we look back to 1918, there were 675,000 U.S. deaths out of a population of only 103 million. And that would be the per capita equivalent today of 2.17 million deaths. And again, this is not to minimize anything that's going on today, but it's to say that we certainly have been through things that are even worse, and we have gotten through them, and it's been rough for a few years or more. And I think we need to, in this time of anxiety, to keep that in mind, is that it's going to be a while and there's going to be suffering and awfulness, but we will be okay. And I think it's important to hold on to that, which is why I wanted to start off by mentioning that.
Yeah, I it's funny because with everything, I think the overwhelming theme this week was just the amount of information and the fact that it changes constantly. I know I was talking with you yesterday and I said, I feel like every day we have a new set of projections and a new set of statistics. And I feel like I can't really grasp my head around, it's this person's fault or that person's fault, or this person needs to be doing this better. This person's not doing enough, because every single day those statistics change. And the one thing that brings me comfort is hearing statistics like the ones that you just said, and sort of, latching on to this idea that we have been through this, that, communities and states and the nation has dealt with things in the past that weren't, I wouldn't say they mirror this situation, but very, very similar, quarantines, lockdowns, things like that. And that we've emerged successful in many ways. And I think one of the things, and I really wanted to bring this up, I think if anything, what this has given our nation and society in general is sort of this idea that technology, it is incredibly important, but it's a useful tool. It's something we can use to, link people together for networking, for work. I mean, I was thinking about H1N1, everything going on with H1N1. Was that 10, 11 years ago? Was that 2009? And, I was thinking about the fact that if this had happened then, working from home would not have been a possibility for most of us. Networking and remaining in touch would not have been a possibility for most of us. And even 10 years before that, things like social media, Zoom, Slack, these incredible platforms that people used to stay in touch and work and be productive wouldn't have existed. So in a lot of ways, we're prepared for this, and that also brings me comfort. Is the fact that all of a sudden we've become reliant on technology. I mean, we're all so quick to sort of bash technology and say, "Oh, it's destroying society," but in a lot of ways, it's helped us through this particular situation. And so I hope to see, full disclosure, I work in a tech field, and I tend to be sort of STEM minded in a lot of ways. But the fact that so many people are building this new respect for technology and networking and things like that. I mean, it can be so powerful. And so I'm sort of keeping my eye on that prize. Maybe this will change the way we deal with technology. Maybe it'll change government's relationship with technology too.
Absolutely. And just, I know we're going to get into all other things you mentioned, but for me, the top story of the week really is these mitigation social distancing efforts are working very well. This week, Anthony Fauci said that more than 1 million Americans could become infected, but it's possible that efforts would keep that below that number. And it was, beginning of or mid-March, people were saying, 20, 40, 60% of Americans could become infected this year. And that's an enormous difference, and I was one of those people who was, doing the numbers and saying, my God, if 10% get infected and there's a 1% death rate, we're looking at something horrifically awful. And just this week, there was a new study from The Lancet, which is one of the most respected medical journals around, finding that the death rate so far for COVID-19 has been around 0.66%, which is obviously a lot better than even that 1% number we're hearing a lot, and certainly a lot better than that 3.4% number that went around. And so I guess, as you pointed out, Kristen, the data keeps on changing, the numbers keep on changing because this is a novel thing, but it's such a human tendency and the tendency of the media to focus on the absolute worst when, and it's not to be, Pollyanna-ish and focus on the absolute best and bury your head in the sand, but understand that maybe there's a middle ground in here. And we need to make, I think, a conscious effort to keep that in mind when so much is pushing us toward fear, anxiety, and in some cases panic. So,
yeah.
But,
and I was going to add that, a lot of us who are, politically inclined and, who look at policy and examine policy, I think we look at everything going on, how divisive things have gotten. And I still see a lot of divisiveness, but some of my more partisan friends on either side of the aisle have sort of come to the middle and have started, developing this attitude of like, okay, this is great. How are we going to work together? I've had people who wouldn't have otherwise agreed with, like, for example, the SBA loan, rollout and things like that, who are suddenly saying, well, maybe this could work. So there's been a lot of out of the box thinking. And again, I'm not necessarily a Pollyanna type person. I like to look at the good side of things. I like to be optimistic, but it's forced me to do the same thing. It's forced me to, look at people who I wouldn't normally look at and say, okay, well, let's listen to what they have to say and do just that. I'm encouraging it amongst my fellow Republican friends. So, this could be positive, I think, if we seized upon it, like you said.
But at least in the short term, it's understandably, I think, more than a bit of a mess. I mean, take for instance, the SBA loan program. There were still plenty of banks who aren't really clear, what's going on. I think it was it JP Morgan, I think, said that, well, we're not really ready to roll this out. And it's understandable. Scaling up to this level so quickly, there are going to be huge problems. And not only that, but so many of the government's computer data management systems and the state level systems are old and creaky and haven't been updated and don't communicate well with each other. And so you put this additional load on them. And then there's the additional concern above that of hacking, stealing personal information. And this is going to be even more of a concern with systems that are being quickly built up and can't be maybe tested and hardened as much. And, I won't say this is a unique to the U.S. problem, but in other countries that have far more robust social safety nets, they already have larger systems in place who have to deal with bigger volumes, relatively speaking. And so they don't have to scale up nearly as much as we do in the U.S. And when we're going from 0 to 200 in almost no time at all, that's a lot more of a job than what some of these European countries are doing. And I know a lot of folks on the left are saying, well, why don't we do things like just send money directly to companies for, paying employees and things like that? I think Denmark has been mentioned, some other countries. Well, in part, it's just we don't have the governmental infrastructure to do that sort of thing. And, we're seeing the problems, I think, inherent in that because, most small businesses, I think, and the average small business has like around 4 weeks they can get by. But even with this expedited loan program, that's going to be pushing it. Businesses are going to be lucky to get that relief in 4 weeks. And so this is the problem when you're trying to go from nothing to this incredibly universal, almost safety net system with so many people need that support.
Right. And we're dealing with a loan program that sort of blows your mind in terms of scope and in terms of size. So it's a $349 billion program that was rolled out. And I remember I was watching the press conference on, I believe it was Thursday night, and there was a lot of discussion about how this would work. They were going to open up the application process the following day. And of course, the first place where my mind went was, how is this going to happen? Just in terms of logistics, $349 billion. And of course, I think it's a great idea in terms of stimulating the economy. I think it has a lot of rightful bipartisan support. But yeah, how is this going to roll out? And of course, as a lot of people predicted, and as I was predicting yesterday, banks were overwhelmed. I mean, Bank of America overwhelmed, and a lot of small business owners and people like that were being smart. They were going to like smaller local banks. I know my husband went to a smaller local bank to try to get the loan. So the idea that we can just roll something out like this is very, very wishful thinking. But I'm just not sure that people realize the scale of a program like this, and the number of small businesses. I mean, and it's funny because when we think about small businesses, the first place my mind goes is the business I work for, which is, I guess you could consider it like a mid-sized business. We had 80 people working for us, and there are other businesses about the same size, but a small business could be a one-person shop, a mom and pop shop, somebody who is an independent contractor. And of course, there are going to be delays there. There's no real system in place for, it is first come, first serve as announced, but, there's no real system in place for what that means and what that means for people who didn't get to submit their applications yesterday. So, I do know that there were a lot of people who did submit their applications. But, $349 billion, that's something that is like unfathomable, and something that, I haven't even quite wrapped my head around that amount of money.
Well,
and what it could
I think it's going to be nothing. There's going to be a lot more. There's going to have to be a lot more coming for that, I think. But, even on a larger level, getting those checks out is been very difficult. We haven't seen checks yet. And the people who are going to get their money first are the people who already have electronic banking information on file with the IRS and have had to file returns and that sort of thing. So the people who are going to get that first are almost certainly the people who need it the least, and the people who need it the most, the people who don't have that information on file or haven't filed, those are the people who need it the most, and it's going to take the longest to get to work with those people and get them the checks. And then there's the unemployment claims, which have, we're talking around 10 million or so, and those are just the filed claims. State unemployment offices are completely overwhelmed, and even though there was $1 billion in federal aid given to these unemployment offices, the money's great, but the money can't create the people and the systems to handle that volume instantly. And again, that goes back to my initial point. We're just not set up for something like this. And so what's going to happen is the people who are in most need of this assistance right away are the people who are going to have to wait the longest to get them. And that's just tragic, you know.
Yeah, I read there were 10 million jobless claims filed within a 2-week span.
Yeah. And it's really more than that, because there are plenty of people who just can't. You hear stories about people, you know, waiting for like a day on hold and systems just crashing. So the real number is certainly higher than that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, you know, there are people who who maybe lost their jobs this week. Maybe they're taking a day or two. I know somebody who falls into that category. She lost her job. A lot of people have been furloughed. And so those are people that we're counting. A lot of people haven't been furloughed yet. They know it's coming. You know, a lot of people, especially people who work in the service industries, in medical offices, those people are going to get furloughed. So this is something that, again, like, you know, it's changing at a mind-blowing speed. Our culture, the economy. You know, we had this incredible 3.5 unemployment in February. I mean, that's like almost doubled at this point. I think the last statistic I read was 6.6. I don't know if you read something similar, but
I've heard
I read that in the Washington Post.
That probably the real unemployment level right now is somewhere around 13%.
Yeah,
which is,
I mean,
you know,
it's wild how quickly this happened. I mean, and it's funny because just on a personal level, when I think to when all this began, it feels like it was months ago. It feels like, you know, just because the days drag on and we're all social distancing and, you know, the days feel very, very long. And, you know, when I think back to the fact that this has really only been for the last 2 weeks, I mean, we've been, you know, relegated to our house for 3. But, you know, when I think about, for example, my husband not being able to go to his office, it's been 2 weeks. Things really shutting down, lockdown orders and stuff. It's been 2 weeks, and so all of this has really happened in the last 2 weeks, maybe 3, and that's just. You know, the impacts are devastating.
And the reason for this, I think, at least to think about the financial impacts, the reason why 45 states have shelter-in-place orders, the reason why we've basically frozen our economy in place, this all goes back to a dramatic failure of testing. Because the only reason everyone has to stay in is because we don't know who has COVID-19 and who doesn't. And we don't have the testing capacity to be able to determine that on any big level. And so until, you know, I mean, I'm sure you've been getting all these questions of when will this end sort of thing. Yeah. Well, you know, absent an actual vaccine, which we're talking like late summer of 2021, which is, you know, that's a long ways off. Then it's all about testing. And if you take a look, even you know, I looked just yesterday, you know, South Korea is at like 1 test for every roughly 122 people. Germany's at much better, 1 test for like around every 83 people. Right now, we're at the United States, 1 test for around every 260 Americans. And that's just not nearly good enough anywhere close to, you know. To give you a sense of this, I mean, we kind of stalled out at a little over 100,000 tests a day. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, there are supply chain reasons. You need people to give the test. You need swabs and all that other kind of thing. But to get to even just where we get to say 10% of Americans have been tested, around, you know, 30-something million people, even if we can ramp almost double testing per day, we're looking at like 6 months. And so this is, you know, people who think, well, we're going to be able to be unlocked down in the beginning of May or something like that. I think that's a little overly optimistic unless we can really ramp up the testing and start, you know, getting a better sense of where this is going. And to me, in this front, maybe one of the more promising things that I'm hoping we can find a way to do more of is that what's called pool testing. And for people who aren't familiar with that, it's where you basically break people into groups, and there are various estimates as to what the best size is, 10, 20, 100. And you take 2 samples from everyone. Then for 1 sample, you pull all the samples in and do 1 test. And if that test is negative, then everyone in that sample is negative. And that's a huge, you eliminate a huge swath right there, depending on the number. And if not, then you just individually test all in the group. So it ends up being 1 more test than you would have done otherwise if you had tested every single person in the group. And so I think, we're still not at the point where even everyone who is symptomatic can necessarily get tested. So we're a ways from that. I know Germany's looking at more pool testing and things like that, but we really have a ways to go. And until we have a really good sense of who has it and who doesn't, we're just not going to be able to open up major parts of the economy again. And that's why I think, for instance, on the small business thing that, 4 weeks, I think the loans are designed to cover 4 weeks of inactivity.
I read 8.
Oh, 8 weeks. Sorry, right. Yeah, 2 months. I don't think that's going to do it. I think there's going to have to be an extension on that for sure. So to me, I think the best, most honest thing that policymakers and politicians can tell Americans is that things will not be anywhere close to back to normal until at least the summer of 2021. And that assumes that everything goes perfectly with the vaccine development and rollout. And that is not necessarily a done deal sort of thing, because we've never done this before for, coronaviruses. But they can also say that as we do enhance our ability to, to test, do contract tracing and that sort of thing and isolate, we'll gradually be able to resume semi-regular activity, but probably not, mass sporting events and concerts and things like that. So I think it's really important to, give people a sense that this is going to be a long haul sort of thing. And I'm disappointed that we're not getting enough of that, I feel, from the very top.
Yeah, I wrote down the name of an article I wanted to point out to the listeners if they haven't already found it. So there's this great Hill article that I pinned it on my work computer, and every day I check it. Everything is, the tables are evolving constantly, but the name of the article is here's when the coronavirus will peak in your state. And I'm sort of like going off of that because it changes a little bit from day to day. It's based on the University of Washington's research on this topic. And the truth is sobering with this because, to start with, when all of this began, I remember thinking, well, what I'm hearing at press conferences, what I'm hearing from people in Congress, what I'm hearing from my local officials here in South Florida is, 15 days. And of course, that was what President Trump was saying, let's try to get things moving along. Let's stay at home for 15 days. And of course, that was extended this week through the end of April. And it's going to be extended again after that. But, like, for example, in the state of Florida, the peak of infection is supposed to be May 3rd. And of course, I'm trying to be rosy. I'm trying to be sunny. I'm trying to, keep the spirits of my family up. And I'm saying, well, we have to deal with this through April, but that's not going to happen. And so, checking this article I think it helps put things in perspective. It's realistic. I don't know. I think at least through late April, May, there are a lot of states that will be peaking in May, which was alarming to me for some reason. I was thinking April. For a long time, these projections were showing that April was going to be the peak times, but now May. And of course, there are hot spots that are popping up constantly. New Orleans has become a hot spot. A lot of people predict or believe that has something to do with Mardi Gras. I know our governor here in Florida, Governor DeSantis, was saying that he believes, and a lot of public health officials in Florida believe, that the Super Bowl was kind of the start of a lot of the spread of this in South Florida. And it's part of the problem of why, we're a hotspot here in Broward County. Miami has become a hotspot. So these large public events, which, and these places where a lot of people congregate, I think it's going to fundamentally change our culture, and it's going to sort of produce, I don't want to say a generation of introverts, but I think it's going to make a lot of us think twice about going to places where there are these large congregated groups of people. I was watching a news show, and they were interviewing John Taffer, who does the Bar Rescue. Do you know who he is?
I do know.
Taffer? Yeah, I'm a big fan of his, and I'm sure some of our listeners know. He basically goes in. He's like a bar fixer. He goes in and kind of does like restaurant rescue type stuff, but for bars. And he's, he understands bar science. He's a businessman. And he was being interviewed on I can't remember what station it was, but he was being interviewed and he was saying, this is going to affect the way we look at, things like going to bars and restaurants, people sitting close together. If a bar or a restaurant looks full, maybe we're going to start second guessing it. And that sort of mentality of social distancing and this idea that maybe we'll become a little more introverted. Maybe we'll become a little more skeptical about gatherings and these large events, parades, sporting events, games, things like that. That's not going to go away anytime soon. And, I think it has its pros and its cons, but I wanted to bring that up because it's a really interesting cultural phenomenon that I think we'll probably see. I don't want to make that prediction, but I do think that we're going to see more of that happening because we're just, old habits die hard. And now we're fearful of other people, which is crazy to think, but this is where we are.
Yeah, I disagree with that, actually. I think
Really?
that while that's going to be a short-term thing, I think people are going to very quickly go back into old gathering habits. There'll be a small segment of people who won't. And that's my concern because after this first wave of this fades, hopefully by mid to late summer, there's certainly a lot of experts who are saying that there's a high probability of a second wave coming in the fall. And I think at that point, a lot of people are going to be just so stir crazy and a lot of these orders are going to be lifted and things are going to be opening up from, some would say, from economic necessity. And we're going to see these gatherings and we're going to see more infections because I think many people just have that natural desire to gather in large groups and they're going to convince themselves, especially when it's something that you cannot see or feel or taste or touch like a virus, that they're going to be okay. And we certainly saw that, early on, obviously with, spring breakers and that sort of thing. So in a way, I hope you're right, but I don't think so. The other thing I wanted to talk about was you mentioned the states still scrambling and outbidding each other for supplies. This week, supposedly on a conference call or on a discussion, everything's a conference call these days or a Zoom meeting with Connecticut's congressional delegation, the FEMA administrators told them that 20% of government orders supplies were going to go to replenish the strategic stockpile, which I get. But then of the remaining 80%, only half would be directed to states, and they were going to let half just be open to bidding on the open market, which I just think is just inconceivable to me. I mean, during normal times, absolutely, I agree that markets are, generally speaking, 90-something times out of 100 the way to go. But if that is true, I just think that's just nuts. I mean, I guess that's a strong word, but it seems to me this is the time, and President Trump has started to invoke the Defense Production Act a little more. He just did it with 3M and mask production, but I think where it really needs to come into play is through that buying, government being the sole purchaser of these things and not putting them out on the market, but allocating them based on the best data we have for needs. Because, hey, there could be big outbreak in, say, Denver or something like that. But right now, I haven't looked at the map, but right now, Denver compared to, say, Newark or New York City, well, that's not where they need the respirators. And so, I think we really need to have that done by a centralized authority. And, I'm not crazy about that as a general rule, but I think under this circumstance, absolutely that's what needs to happen. And so I certainly hope that President Trump will invoke that authority, which I think he should have done probably about 3 weeks or more ago. And I'm very disappointed that hasn't happened at this point.
Well, he's been talking about this more and more. I've heard some language and some heated exchanges with the press about this. One thing that what you just mentioned made me think of is in the last couple of days, Andrew Cuomo has really taken a lot of heat in New York for using some of this language. I know a lot of the media has accused him of wanting to, the word they're using, I think, is seize. I've heard the word confiscate used too, but seize medical devices and PPE, this personal protective equipment, for the sake of the state, and then sort of doling that out to harder hit areas like New York City. And so there seems to be this backlash, especially in the media. I've seen it both on right leaning media and left leaning media about seizing this equipment and sort of redistributing this equipment. And he went on the record defending himself. I think it was yesterday. He was defending himself, saying it's not a seizure. What this is equipment sharing. And so now this has presented a whole new situation where, who ultimately has the authority to do this? Is this something that should be state by state? Should governors be, sort of looking out for the entire state? Should this be up to local authorities? What about, private charity hospitals and things like that? How do they factor into this? Nonprofits, independent contractors. So, and of course, the role of the president factors into all of this. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is an ongoing thing. And I predict, not that I can really predict much with all of this, but I predict that this is going to be a hot issue in this coming week. So we'll probably be discussing this in the future on this show.
And just to be clear, I think there are two distinct but related things here. And the first is the actual production of these things. And under the Defense Production Act, the president does have the authority to basically buy up everything that's being produced in these areas and then dole it out. That's a different thing from sharing or seizing, whatever word you want to use, already produced and purchased things. And that is definitely a much greater and more questionable infringement on property rights. And so I don't think anyone should take that lightly. But as Governor Cuomo has, pointed out, that these are incredibly desperate times. And when, say, a hospital in some place, has a respirator that is actually not being used, and when there are people who are dying because there are respirators that they need, well, that's a pretty compelling reason for, I guess you could call it forced sharing, but that raises, a bunch of other obviously very serious issues, certainly.
Right. And all of this calls to mind I think he's great, or I think he was great, Charles Krauthammer. He used to talk about this idea of like seizing and forced orders and things like that. And, it was brought up. I watched somebody talk about it yesterday on Fox News, and then somebody, I think in Politico, referenced the statement he made when the Ebola, there was a small Ebola outbreak. I think that was it 2014, 2015, something like that?
Sounds right.
Maybe 2016, a few years ago, there was this Ebola outbreak, and he had made a statement. Basically, what he was alluding to is the fact that, it's wrong to keep people at home. It's wrong to seize things and to confiscate things and do these things. It's wrong. It's in terms of personal liberty, it's a disaster. I mean, can you just, you can almost see Rand Paul with his head in his hands and Thomas Massey with his head in his hands, and those of us that tend to be more liberty minded to that extent are really conflicted with all of this. But, then he said there are certain circumstances where this stuff is necessary. And so the question is, how far do we move the needle to, one way or the other? And I think this is one of those scenarios. Like I said, I predict that this is going to be a hot topic. But I know in Florida, we've had a lot of problems with it. A lot of local officials, especially here in Broward County and South Florida, have been on national news channel stations on cable news talking about the problems that they've had trying to get respirators because, as a lot of people know, Broward County in Florida, this is sort of the epicenter. And in Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood, stuff like that, we have a huge population of elderly and infirmed people. And not to mention the fact that we have a lot of people who were here for the winter season and they've just decided to stay. And so, we've had all sorts of things going on here that are unprecedented. Police officers doing these almost like checks on people coming into Broward County on the roads, on our major interstate systems, are stopping people and turning them away, almost like there's this invisible border. And so a lot of people here in Broward County, a lot of public health officials and elected officials have become increasingly frustrated. And it's been this rare moment of, again, like bipartisan unity on this, is that, we can't get what we need here. And there are probably hospitals elsewhere in the state of Florida that have these respirators and are being used, that have this PPE that's not being utilized. And so, I think a lot of us who tend to be more personal, oriented in terms of liberty are questioning that for the first time. And I don't know, it's making me a little uncomfortable, frankly.
Well, which is interesting because Florida, there have been reports that Florida has basically gotten everything it's asked for from the federal government, whereas other states have gotten less. And the reasoning has not necessarily been all that transparent, though some people have pointed out that the president and Governor DeSantis are pretty good friends, are in regular contact. And of course, that Florida is the biggest swing state in the upcoming elections. And that certainly we don't know. And that's part of the problem, is that the process, that's going to be the problem with any process that's not based on ability to pay, is that what are the decision criteria? Well, FEMA and agencies say, well, it's about population and projected need and things like that. And certainly Florida is a big state with a lot of projected need, I think in part because the governor unconscionably waited as long as he did to issue a statewide stay-at-home order, which I think is just horrific. But anyway, he finally did. So there's that as well. And the other issue we didn't talk about was the mask issue. Now, there's two parts of this. Number one, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to basically tell 3M that, hey, those masks you are making overseas and, distributing, you need to send those here and not to sell those overseas. And that's a little bit different than telling a company that's making something in the United States that we get to buy it all up and you can't ship it overseas, you can't export it. And there are some people who are concerned that, well, this sort of order might actually backfire. And that's what 3M, in my understanding, it says, listen, you do this and you might actually have there be fewer masks and PPE coming into the country because other states or other countries are going to retaliate. And given the fact that so much of this protective equipment is made overseas by non-American companies, this could actually have a cumulatively overall negative effect. And of course, I hope they're wrong, and I hope the president's advisors, took that into consideration, but that certainly is a possibility.
Yeah, I just on a personal note, it's funny because for the last few weeks, I live very close to a big hospital here in South Florida, Cleveland Clinic, actually. And it's one of the testing sites, one of the major testing sites in the west part of my county. And of course, we live close to another testing site. And the only thing we've really been able to do is drive around on major roads and keep our windows closed just to beat the boredom and get out of the house. So, we've been doing that. And one of the things that I've noticed is, there seems to be, for the last few weeks anyway, there seems to have been this push away from masks, that the masks don't necessarily stop the disease. The science isn't there. These aren't facts. And of course, we're hearing this on a lot of different fronts. The media is talking about this. Elected officials are talking about this. I've even seen PSAs on TV that talk about the fact that washing hands is more effective than mask wearing, which I think that makes a lot of sense. Yet, when you drive past these, testing facilities, everybody has on a mask. When I go out we're driving around, or even when I'm walking around my neighborhood, everybody's wearing a mask. So about a week ago, I started wondering, how correct is this information? And do we even really know? Which kind of goes back to everything we've been talking about. The fluidity of the situation is something we, most of us have never experienced. So now there seems to be this push towards masks. I know I was telling you earlier that I went on YouTube and looked up ways to make these face masks without sewing, because I can't sew to save my life. So, it's very interesting. If you need masks, they're just not available. I know just to see, because I figured we would talk about this, just to see earlier this morning, I went on Google and I just started, Googling masks and Amazon, and most of them, won't even ship to your house until June. And then at that point, what good is it? So, it's this whole mask thing is baffling. And I don't know if we're going to, if there will be, conflicting information on that.
Well, I think it seems to me that it's not perfectly clear, but clear enough that masks can potentially help, at least by if you are a carrier and are asymptomatic, then you're going to be less likely to be able to spread it. And so it's good in that way. And, we know that the main way that people seem to get this is through it coming in through, eyes, nose, and mouth and that sort of thing. So if you at least partially even cover those openings, then it's going to make it at least marginally less likely. So it's one of those things where it probably can't hurt unless people then feel this false sense of security. But I think actually most people, when they see everyone around with a mask, just feel like they want to stay even further away. So it certainly marginally can help. And, people who are able to make these masks, I'm thankful my mother-in-law can sew, and she's great at it. And she sent some masks out that she made to myself and Kimberly, and that's great. And we'll be wearing those. But what sort of disappointed me, and I use that word a lot in regards to the president, is that when he made that announcement this week, late this week, this was an opportunity. This was a golden opportunity for a real leader to drive home the seriousness. And that would be by making that announcement in a homemade cloth mask. He totally could have done that. All of a sudden, all those people across the country, and there are millions of them. I've talked to some of them who've said, this isn't really a thing, not here, not anything like that. They see the president, their president, you know what I mean in that sense, with a mask on. All of a sudden, it's a holy shit moment. And then people start taking this very seriously. And I think, you and I are taking it seriously, but there are plenty of people who still aren't. And I was talking to someone who did some, work for the House. She said, I'm the only one in the office who seems to take this seriously. Everyone else says I'm crazy. I'm like, well, this is the problem. And so this was a great opportunity for the president to show some leadership, some real leadership. And yeah, he would have looked a little silly, and that's why he didn't do it, I'm sure. And that's just incredibly disappointing. Every time I think that this man cannot disappoint me more. He is, as I said last week, regardless of what you think about his policies, temperamentally, I cannot think of a worse person to be president of the United States in this situation. I would give everything for, not everything. I would give a lot to have George W. Bush. I think would be orders of magnitude better in this situation. Richard Nixon, orders of magnitude better in this situation. Pretty much anyone you can think of, but this guy, God.
So by that token, if we're talking about the optics of mask wearing, what about everybody, all of our elected officials sort of coming together on this and doing this? Because, for 2 months, I remember Dr. Fauci coming on TV and saying, this is something we don't have to worry about. We don't need to worry about this. This is something that's relegated to other countries. I listened to, of course, Donald Trump and his administration saying, listen, we have to keep the economy running. And this is something, we don't need to worry about this right now. But I also heard people on the left. Nancy Pelosi was visiting Chinatown in San Francisco and saying the same thing. We're open for business, visit Chinatown, and across the board in my state of Florida, from the top, Governor DeSantis, my local officials who are mostly Democrats were saying the same thing. We're open for business. And part of the failure, I think, or most of the failure kind of lies in both camps. And wouldn't it be great to take that a step further and say, why don't we all wear masks when we appear? Because what's happening, and this is something I haven't heard talked about hardly at all. I heard it mentioned maybe a week ago, but you're the first person who's mentioned it, at least, in my experience in the last week. I'm watching the news, and, of course, most newscasters on most of the major cable stations are broadcasting from their homes, these, live broadcasts, and they're interviewing people who are also at home. But then, you have people who are working in government positions, elected officials who are out and about, who are walking the streets. Some of them, up until about a week ago, were outside the Capitol building, still in Washington D.C. and not home with their families. So, it's hard for any of us to take this seriously. Unless we see all of government sort of focusing on this united effort. And it is all about optics. I understand the struggle that they must be going through, where it's like, well, do we try to appear strong and resolute, or do we risk looking stupid? And I think what you said kind of calls that to mind. Like, right now, this looks pretty stupid for them to go up to a podium without a mask on. People, a local official of here in Broward County just got in trouble for making this big statement about stay at home, and then rubbing his hand on the side of his face. I mean, the optics are like out of control, terrible.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think both parties could do more. But in the end, Nancy Pelosi is not president of the United States. and that the president of the United States is the symbol of the country, and to the biggest swath of people who are not taking this as seriously as they should, he has a special relationship with those people. And so that there is no image that would bring home the seriousness, even if he just did it for a second, of the image of President Donald J. Trump in a mask. That is the most powerful image that we would get of the seriousness of this. And so I would think, even just for a moment, it would be a true act of leadership for the president to put on a mask and to have himself photographed in that mask, because that would have some strong emotional resonance. And I doubt he'll ever do it. In fact, he went the other way. So, well, I'm not going to do it. That is just Trumpian irresponsibility. Just what sadly I've come to expect from him.
All right. So, do we have time to move along to one more topic?
I think we do, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So, should we talk about Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's next.
Speaking of irresponsibility, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll focus for a minute. Instead of focusing on the country as a whole, we'll focus on one state where there's a primary coming up this Tuesday, and that is Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, elected officials and judges are sort of at loggerheads over how this coming Tuesday's primary will proceed. The issue is centered on the controversy over mail-in voting. So that seems to be the source for all this, of course. And the question here is the risk of coronavirus greater than the risk of possible voter fraud, which is what a lot of people on the right are upset about. And will we see this play out in other states, I think, is the bigger question. As we move through this process, as, primaries continue, as we get closer to election time, is this something that we're going to have to address on a larger scale? We've seen some states, postpone the primaries or extend the deadlines for primaries, but it seems to be particularly marked in Wisconsin now, because most of the people on the left, as you know, and probably a lot of our listeners know, are saying, no, we can't risk coronavirus. Let's do mail-in voting. A lot of people on the right, and there are, of course, reasons for this, are saying, no, this is an opportunity for voter fraud. So I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I think that
I know how you feel about that.
I think the Wisconsin legislature is just incredibly irresponsible. This is disgraceful. I think, earlier on, the governor asked the legislature to send mail ballots to all registered voters. He asked them to lift the photo ID requirements for mail-in voters, asked them to extend in-person early voting through the final weekend before the election, and asked them to move back deadlines for returning absentee ballots, as well as move back the deadlines for counting them. Now, even if you're a big vote fraud person, and that's a whole other issue, which is, it's not a thing, but even if you say it's a thing, say, okay, well, I could understand the legislature saying, you know what, we're not going to lift the photo ID requirement. We think that's really important. But given what's going on, the legislature saying, no, we're not going to do the mail. We're not going to send out the mail out the ballots. We're not going to extend early voting. We're not going to move back the deadlines for returning ballots and counting them. There's no good reason for that. That's not an integrity of elections. That's BS. And that is, I hope the voters of Wisconsin let the legislature know what they think about it. I hope they think it's important enough, because of course, yeah, the presidential primary, that's not a thing that's essentially decided at this point, but there are other races as well. Mm-hmm. And particularly there's one, I believe, state judge race that the party is very concerned about. And that blows my mind. That being said, I agree with the federal judge's decision where he said, it's not my role to postpone elections. Yeah. I think this is a horrible decision, but I am not the public health official or anything, or anything like that. Right. But the judge did put in certain, in his rulings, he extended the deadline for absentee ballots. He extended the deadline for ballots to be received by local officials, I think, to April 13th. And he also prohibited that state requirement that say that absentee envelopes have to have that witness signature. And, that's when the party was saying, well, you can just have the mailman look through your window or something like that. It's ridiculous stuff like that. And even those, I think, very reasonable conditions that the judge put on, well, the Wisconsin Republican Party is appealing that. So that's just no, we can't have that. And that's the sort of thing that I think is just unconscionable, really.
Yeah, I agree with you on a lot of what you said. So I was going to point out what the judge said. The judge's ruling that this is a terrible idea, but I really don't have a place in this argument. I can't necessarily call off a primary election, a primary vote for something like this. This isn't in my purview, and I agreed with that. And I think that was the correct response, but. Kind of taking it a step further, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a voter fraud person. There are people who are, much more up in arms about that than I am. I do think that it happens. I think it happens more frequently with mail-in voting. I think it's easier to kind of rig the system. And I, it's funny because I say that not necessarily as a Republican, but just as somebody who's concerned about the democratic process in general. I think it is, especially in my county, I'm thinking of things that have gone on here in Broward County. We've had a lot of problems with mail-in votes. I know in 2018, we had problems with boxes of mail-in votes being found. I mean, in Florida, we just seem to have a lot of these issues in general and in Broward County. So I guess it's just something that's always lurking in the back of my mind, just as a concerned citizen. But that being said, I agree with you that I think that the legislature is making a terrible decision here. And I think that this is one of those situations like, what Charles Krauthammer was referencing long ago. One of these situations where there are, circumstances that call for, a new way of doing things. Other states have followed suit. Other states have extended the deadline. They've, encouraged mail-in votes. I don't think that Wisconsin, just in terms of the public health scenario, like you said, has a choice in this matter. And Republicans who are interested in holding this, this vote on Tuesday, I think that they are using this as an opportunity, a political opportunity. Both parties do it, and the Republicans are doing it here. They're taking advantage of this opportunity. They shouldn't. And it's concerning because it seems like other states have, made concessions that needed to be made, but Wisconsin, it's such a problem, and I'm interested to see how that plays out as we get closer to the 2020 election. If this is a situation that's going to be duplicated, if this is going to change the way we do things, I don't know that it will in future elections, but certainly for this year, the way that we approach this, the way we even think about logistically how we're going to be rolling this out and how people are going to be voting has got to change because of this. So yeah, I mean, all eyes are on Wisconsin. I'm interested to see what happens on Tuesday.
Yeah, definitely. And it can't be done. Oregon's been doing mail voting for, I think, 20 years or more now. Yeah. And so it's not like we don't have any very good models for that sort of thing. And I agree with you. While I disagree with some of the long-term implications you were suggesting earlier for how people might change in terms of social distancing, I do think we're going to see a longer-term change in much more availability of no excuse or almost entirely, even in some cases, maybe vote-by-mail systems. And I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. So, before we get to our weekly recommendation, we've spent this entire episode talking about COVID-19 related things. Of course we have. I mean, it's what everyone's thinking about. But I've also been wondering, are there any things that people feel that we're maybe not covering or under covering in these discussions? And I asked that question in our Bipartisan Politics Reddit group, and I got some great suggestions and answers, so much so that I thought this would be a really good thing to do for an entire special episode, things that you feel we're not giving enough attention to, or maybe we could focus a little more on. And already I gotten some good things. So if you have an idea or suggestion, there are a lot of ways you can let us know. You can pass along those ideas through email, mail@politicsguys.com. You can post a comment in our bipartisan politics groups on Reddit. I started a topic there called Gaps in Our COVID-19 Coverage, just for that purpose. Or you can post a comment on our Facebook page comment section for the post that we'll have up with this episode. So a lot of ways to do that. So
we had some great topics going, on a list that we didn't even get to.
Oh my God, yeah, exactly.
This is the juggernaut. So I mean, I hope next week's show we get to some of these great topics, because there are some good ones going on that are not COVID-19 related.
Definitely. So recommendations, Kristen, what do you have for us this week?
All right. So I've been doing a lot of reading. I know you are. I know probably a lot of our listeners are. I know some of our hosts are. So I have a recommendation for a book that I'm currently reading. And then I also have a documentary recommendation for those of you who love TV like I do. So the book I'm actually reading, and I'm about halfway through it, is called Dead Wake by Erik Larson, who, I mean, a lot of people know who Erik Larson is. He's a nonfiction writer, very famous nonfiction writer, best-selling author, journalist. He does all nonfiction. He wrote Isaac Storm, which is great. He wrote The Splendid and the Vile, which is about Winston Churchill. Devil in the White City. A lot of people have probably read that. So I'm reading Dead Wake, which is about the sinking of the Lusitania during World War I. And I think it's such an interesting account of everything that happened. It's something I didn't know a lot about. I remember, hearing about the Lusitania and, AP history back in high school, and maybe referenced a couple times in history classes in college, but it's not something we normally think about. And I recommend just about anything Erik Larson writes. He's such an amazing writer.
Cool.
So it's good. There's some element of escapism. It's a good story to read right now. I think it's captivating, it's compelling, and just very well done. He's a good storyteller. And the other recommendation I have is actually a documentary that I watched with my kids, although it's family friendly, but it's not necessarily for kids. It's available on Prime, Amazon Prime, and it's called Antarctica: A Year on Ice. And I don't know that I've ever said this on the show, but I have this weird rabbit hole fascination with Antarctica.
Huh.
I don't know why. It's like that in Chernobyl. I just have these weird fascinations with weird things. But Antarctica is one of those places. I think it's just so different from what I'm used to. I mean, I've lived my whole life in the American South and South Florida, and so this weird fascination with Antarctica came a couple of years ago, actually listening to a science podcast episode. And so I highly recommend this documentary. It's not very long, maybe an hour and a half, but it's very compelling. The documentarian, who's from New Zealand, actually has lived in Antarctica for years, but he decided to live there for one full year. That's summer and winter, and the winters are brutal there. And just capture everything on camera. And so I've never really seen anything like it. The camera work is really well done. It's actually funny in some parts. Some of the people who live there year round, the scientists and other people who work there, talk about how normal it is, which kind of blew my mind. So yeah, I recommend both of those, both like good escapes for everything going on right now. What about you?
All right. Well, yeah, I'll recommend a couple of escapist things as well. I already mentioned my book in progress thing. Link will be there on the show notes. Another show that my wife and I just absolutely love is a show called Puppy Prep on Hulu. And it's the story of, I think, 5 or 6 young dogs who go through service dog training school. And it is just the most adorable, heartwarming thing I've seen in a long time. So that is great. And then finally, what I would call a rationally optimistic blog post from a guy named, not named, this isn't his real name, Mr. Money Mustache. And he's it's a pseudonym. He's the leading figure, I would say, in the FIRE movement, which is financial independence, retire early. And it's a blog post called "No, You Didn't Just Lose Half of Your Retirement Savings." And even if you don't plan on retiring early, or you're already retired or what have you, he's worth checking out, especially on this. And one of the conclusions he comes to is that what we're doing right now in the United States is essentially foregoing about $1 million of economic activity for each person's life that we extend. And he says, I think that's a great and compassionate thing, and it makes him very happy. Now, I think the number might be more like 1.5 or maybe even 2 million, but still, the point still holds, and the whole post is definitely worth reading, especially if you need a shot of economic coronavirus, COVID-19 related optimism. Definitely check that out.
I will.
All right. All right. Now, again,
great.
all that will be in our show notes. And that does do it for this show. But Kristen, as you said, we had a lot of stuff we didn't cover, and we are going to get to as much of it as we can in our midweek supporters show. We wanted to talk about, gun stores closing and abortion clinics closing, and the people who are filing lawsuits about that during this crisis. I think that's just a really fascinating interplay of, rights, liberties versus security in this case, on both the right and the left. So I know we'll get into that. And one thing that's been buried this week largely has been the new report by the Justice Department's Inspector General that basically said that, well, pretty much every single FISA warrant that the FBI submitted was junk, and not junk, but had pretty major problems. Yeah, that's a huge issue as well. And we haven't yet even talked about what's going on with Venezuela and our efforts to, new efforts to oust Maduro there. And God, they have a huge problem as well for a lot of reasons. So we're going to get to as much of that as we can on the Wednesday supporters exclusive show. And if you want to hear that, well, if you're a supporter, it'll already be in your feed by Wednesday, actually. But if you're not and you want to become a supporter, patreon.com/politicsguys. And I just got to say that we have had, a bunch of people supporting the show in the last few weeks, and it means a lot, especially during this stressful and difficult and uncertain time. So thank you all so much. And also, please remember, if you can't afford to become a supporter, we get it. We want to make sure we can get all that content to you. So just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up. All right. If you have a question, comment, correction, just want to say, hey, you can do that. mail@politicsguys.com. And also, I keep on mentioning our bipartisan politics subreddit. It is great. Check it out. You can search for it at Reddit or the show note, or the link will be in our show notes. And finally, we have a Facebook page where we post stuff, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we are on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show is produced by Chris Matheny and me, Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.